How is the same system that allowed Amorim to end Sporting's 19-year league trophy drought threatening to plunge United into their darkest days? Well, it's not a problem with the system itself. After all, the legendary Johan Cruyff's Barcelona often deployed this. It's also not the case that it doesn't work in this era of football. Gasperini's Atalanta and Alonso's Bayer Leverkusen are shining beacons of success. And it's definitely not that the system doesn't work in the Premier League. Conte's Chelsea broke a heap of records with the system, and even Guardiola's greatest City sides, which were 4-3-3s on paper, essentially attacked the same way a 3-4-3 does. So what exactly is the issue? The answer becomes crystal clear when we compare Amorim's United against one of the most successful 3-4-3s in recent Premier League history, Thomas Tuchel's Chelsea. Now, over Tuchel's prolonged reign, and with Amorim approaching a year as United, it's difficult to pinpoint a guaranteed first-choice 11. But for the purposes of this video, we'll examine their most common lineups, while primarily looking at United's probable first-choice 11 this season. Let's start with what made Tuchel's system purr. One of the strengths of Tuchel's back three was just how proactive it was. When they were in possession, they were rarely ever static, and it all began from the left centre-back Antonio Rudiger, who was consistently aggressive with the ball at his feet, which was vital for a few reasons. Building with the back three is great because against sides who press with two forwards, the opposition is never able to go completely man-to-man in the press because the third centre-back is always the escape valve. And Rudiger was that escape, as when he received the ball, he would push up into the midfield with the ball at his feet. But here's the thing, it was against sides who were pressing with one forward or didn't press at all that this movement became even more important. Having one spare man in the build-up is great, but having two spare men quickly becomes wasteful, as those extra men could be better used high up the pitch, as passing options, goal-scoring threats, or just general disruptive entities. And that's exactly what Rudiger's movement allowed, as he pushed higher up the pitch to join and disrupt the midfield. He wasn't alone either. When the opposition gave Azpilicueta room, he wasn't shy about pushing up the pitch. So how does this compare with Amorim's back three? Early in his tenure, Amorim was far less adventurous with his backline. Even when opponents invited them forwards by giving them room in the wider regions, the centre-backs often declined that invitation, staying in that flatter three instead, again leading to potentially wasted men in possession. As time has gone on, however, especially this season, we've seen more and more of the wider centre-backs pushing up. Shaw at left centre-back, as well as both Mazraoui and Yoro when operating off the right, have been more than willing to do this, making the build-up play a lot more dynamic. But a back three in the build-up is about so much more than just the wider centre-backs. At the heart of both systems is the central centre-back. For Thomas Tuchel, it was the aging Thiago Silva. Having the more mobile pairing outside of him meant that in sustained possession, Silva could be relatively stable positionally, not having to do too much moving around. Not only that, Thiago Silva was renowned for his intelligence in defending without the ball. But another key element of his game was his incredible ball-playing ability when he did have it. He had the skill set that allowed him to break the line with a pass into the double pivots or even a longer ball over the top into a forward or a wing-back making a run in behind. This meant the back three alone was a cohesive structure. If the opponent was overly concerned with stopping Thiago Silva as the source, the outball to the progressors was always on the cards. But if they were too passive trying to stop the ball into the midfield, or over-indexed on stopping the wider centre-backs, Thiago Silva now had time and space on the ball and could begin to dictate the play. For Amorim, the role of primary ball progressor has fallen to De Ligt at Manchester United. And it makes sense. His Ajax upbringing ensured that he's more than comfortable doing this. And he's been putting in his best efforts. But a look at the stats reveals a startling truth. Only 2.4 progressive passes per match, enough to place him in the bottom 24th percentile for centre-backs. This pales when compared to Thiago Silva, who had far greater quality and quantity of progressive passes and balls into the final third. So why is this? Did De Ligt suddenly forget how to progress the ball? Of course not. The first factor is Thiago Silva is naturally one of the best ball-playing centre-backs in recent history, so most defenders couldn't lace his boots in this regard. But there are two more important things to consider. First, in the deep phases, they're being used fundamentally differently. Amorim often asked De Ligt to move into a pivot position early in the build-up play. That naturally means that De Ligt, in the deep phase, is often being requested to play with his back to goal rather than getting his head up. Receiving with your back to goal is a tricky enough situation even for many great pivots, so it's no surprise that many of De Ligt's passes end up being safer options, going backwards, usually an automatism to Lenny Yoro at right centre-back. Silva, in contrast, playing the central centre-back position more traditionally, spent most of his time looking ahead at the pitch, like most defenders do. But here's the real crux of the issue. Even when United have moved higher up, and De Ligt is in a more natural position with his head up like Silva, De Ligt and Silva were fundamentally looking at different images. See, when De Ligt or any of the United centre-backs got their head up, they were greeted by an image like this. Two fairly stationary pivots just waiting to receive the ball. Except it gets so much worse, because on most occasions, the opposition doesn't even actively press the centre-backs, instead opting to keep United's double pivot in their cover shadow. And now we must talk about the personnel in these roles, as this is heavily linked to the issue. But before we think about the difference in the pivot positions, we must talk about the floaters higher up the field, who can be called wingers or attacking midfielders, depending on your interpretation. At Chelsea, the floaters often consisted of two of these men. First, regardless of which three played, we saw a lot of fluidity in the front line, with the front three in constant rotation, making it borderline impossible for the centre-back to know who they were picking up, as it was ever-changing. But more importantly, almost all of those men were not only comfortable dropping deep, but were under instruction to consistently move deep whenever the pivots were under pressure and needed a third option. So while on paper it looked like Chelsea might be vulnerable through the middle due to only having two men in the midfield, the reality is they were often 3 versus 2, 4 versus 3, or 5 versus 3 up, meaning that the backline always had available options. Coming back to Amorim's side, when the centre-backs looked up, what they saw for the most part was the static pivots, and not much more than that. The men taking up these positions for United tended to be genuine wingers or inside forwards whose forte was not dropping into the midfield, but instead looking to make the runs in behind. And by the way, making runs in behind is not a bad thing at all. Werner often played off the left for Chelsea, and he was primarily the runner in behind. But he was paired with forwards who could drop in, so if the centre-backs followed the droppers too closely, Werner could be found over the top. But the Germans' runs could also force the defense to drop deep earlier than usual, and this just opened up more space for Mount and Havertz to operate between the lines. But at United, Højlund was often flanked by the likes of Garnacho, Ahmad, and Rashford, and it resulted in a front line that was primarily focused on running in behind, meaning even if space did open up, there was rarely someone in the correct position with the correct skill set to take advantage. Amorim, of course, was aware of these issues, which is why he flirted with the idea of Fernandes as one of the floaters, but he was needed elsewhere. But of course, the common denominator between these two sides is Mason Mount, but spending most of the prior season injured meant that he couldn't perform this dropping role for United. However, with his return and the acquisition of Cunha, it will be interesting to see if Amorim adapts his personnel. But that still doesn't solve the issue through the centre, because the makeup of the personnel in the pivot positions was crucial. Tuchel's midfield was always 2 out of these 3. It seems simplistic, but the very first box that they checked is that if you're asked to position them anywhere on the pitch in a 3-4-3, the first choice position for all 3 men would be the 2 pivot positions. For United, on the other hand, their midfield was always 2 of these 3. And one of the midfielders who has most often played as a pivot would not pick the pivot position as his first choice position. So why not just play the 2 actual pivots in the pivot positions? Well, comparing the numbers of the pairs alone makes for stark reading. In comparison to Jorginho and Kovacic, there was essentially no ball progression from those pivot positions for United. Even N'Golo Kante, who is not renowned as a high-volume passer, at least brought progression in the form of his ability to carry the ball at his feet. Again, none of which Ugarte or Casemiro were particularly great at. Fernandes was almost forced to play as a pivot, as the only one remotely capable of progressing the ball for the side. But he is still an attacking midfielder at heart, which means that risk is just part of his game. So it's not the safe metronomic passing expected of a pivot, but rather it's the expansive passes of an attacking maverick that look great when they pay off, but also lead to a much lower completion rate as well as unnecessary turnovers. Add to that the fact that Chelsea's pivots were highly technical and happy to receive on the half turn, whereas United's are not and instead tend to play safe, and the progression issues for United become glaringly obvious. But it's not that all the problems for the side have simply come through the middle of the park. The wingback areas have also presented key issues. The first is simple: consistency. Injuries aside, Tuchel had a preferred wingback pairing in Reece James and Ben Chilwell, with the likes of Alonso being more than capable backups in the position. Amorim, on the other hand, has had a rotating cast of wingbacks. We've seen a fair bit of wingbacks playing on their non-dominant side, such as Dalot as a left wingback and Diallo as a right wingback. What this means is when the wingbacks get into crossing positions, they're either delivering from their weaker side or more likely being forced to cut back onto their stronger foot to allow a better delivery. The effect of this is that the attack is slowed down as a result. Compare this to the confident delivery from Chelsea's own wingbacks, who, when they got into position, had no reason for hesitation. And all of this is layered with the defensive element of the game. In most matches, on the defensive end, United have simply dropped their wingbacks deeper as they shifted into a deep 5-2-3. This can work if the team defends as a unit, either dropping deep or pushing higher up in unison. But a key issue they face is that the front three often launch into a somewhat half-hearted press, and if these three are bypassed, the Reds' midfield is immediately heavily overloaded, allowing the opponent to play through easily. This isn't helped by Fernandes not being a pivot by trade, meaning that he can easily be lured into bad pressing situations, leaving his partner even more isolated. Chelsea, on the other hand, would almost instantly adapt as soon as they lost the ball, from a 5-2-3 in most cases, to now having Mason Mount drop in behind the two forwards, so the shape was now more of a 5-2-1-2. Unless the opponent was operating in a diamond, the Blues were rarely overloaded through the centre. But even if the opponent was able to get an extra man into the midfield, this is where the hyper-aggressive wide centre-backs came into play. Their mobility wasn't just of use to Chelsea in possession. When out of possession, if the opponent forwards did try to drop in to create the overload, it was a familiar sight to see Rudiger or Azpilicueta harrying their men and following them as deep on the pitch as possible, with the rest of the defense seamlessly covering the vacated space. United have tried to implement this at times, but with less success. But where they have had success is when they've sat deeper in a compact shape, as a narrow 5-2-3 has at times been effective at preventing the opponent building through the middle. But when the opponent does attack the wide space, rather than being front foot and having the wingbacks press the advancing man, they tend to be late or not push up at all, perhaps expecting a wider forward to cover, and as a result, this allows the opposition to easily move into their half and set up camp. Compare this to Chelsea, who, knowing that they had a narrow 2 in the defensive phase, would instantly commit the ball side wingback to pressing the opposition fullback, whilst the mobile wider centre-back would be happy to temporarily move into a fullback position to cover. But all of these granular tactical issues are surface level. The real problem is deeper, because when looking at Tuchel's managerial career, what do we see here? Tuchel was not a man married to the 3-4-3 at all. In fact, he had heavily been a manager who favoured a back four. But when he got to Chelsea, suddenly he became pretty much an out-and-out 3-4-3 man. What was the reason for this? Well, it's simple. He assessed his squad and realised that this system and the principles he was implemented were best suited to his Chelsea side. The aging but vital centre-back, the attacking fullbacks, and the abundance of wingers who loved to drift in centrally. He found a formation and a system that suited them. Amorim, on the other hand, used a 3-4-3 in essentially every single match at Sporting and has attempted to port his system over to Manchester United. It was a premeditated decision without concern for assessing his squad first. This has led to personnel issues, such as taking his one world-class player, Bruno, and forcing him to play in a position where he's good, maybe even great on occasion, rather than keeping him in the position where he's truly world-class. Now, is this an Amorim issue or a board issue? Supposing the board had monitored Amorim for a long time, they would have noticed that he was a man with strong principles who believed in a specific system, and expecting him to change would have been a tough ask. But at the same time, when the results have gone this poorly, showing flexibility like Tuchel did would hardly have been a step back. It would show that he could tweak his system while still sticking to his broad principles like any top manager. In essence, there really is no such thing as a bad formation. formation, just a formation that is ill-suited to a specific set of players. Oh, and if you want to make 2025-26 the season that you learn the fundamentals of tactical analysis for free, check out Tactics 12 through the link in the description below. It's a completely free resource I've put together where you'll learn the building blocks of analysis over a 12-day period, completely free. And if you want a deeper look to see the broader problems with United before Amorim, check out the video on screen now.